appreciate that we identified THC as the active constituent, but what they may have not caught along the way is that the science continued, not here in the United States, but elsewhere, and we were able to identify 2 subsequent receptors. After identifying these receptors, pharmacologists and researchers realized that these receptors are probably there for a reason, and then subsequently discovered the endocannabinoids that we discussed on the earlier slide. These endocannabinoids were found to be analgesic, and which really supports the use of cannabinoids as a whole for pain relief. But I think what's good is how it leads to a common analogy that's easy for most people to understand, and we'll talk about that on the next slide here. So I think when you put it into perspective what we know about these endocannabinoids, everybody out in the public knows about endorphins and that terminology, and those are displayed here on the bottom part of this graph. The similarities are here because the endorphins were discovered based on people's use of the poppy plant. Here on the top half you can see that for historical use of the cannabis plant. Everybody's very familiar with the story of opioids, how that later got used in medicine in the Middle Ages, and then subsequently morphine was derived from the plant. We found the receptors, the mu receptors that augment pain relief, and then subsequently found the endorphins. And this became common knowledge to pretty much everybody out there. What people missed along the way, or where science kind of let us down in disseminating this information, was that the same thing actually occurred with cannabis only 20 years later, so to speak. So once cannabis got into the fray and being used in the 18 and 1900s, it was a longer time until the active ingredient was identified in the 60s. But that's where it kind of fell off, and not many people ever heard about the subsequent discoveries, which were the receptors and the endogenous cannabinoid system. So I think having an appreciation for that endogenous system helps one appreciate the medical therapeutic effects of cannabis as well. It's not just that the change in psychoactivity or the high produced is altering pain. There are true physiological interactions happening at these receptors. So once we started to move forward with research, this is just a good graph, although it ends in 2008, just showing the exponential increase in cannabinoid research. The most recent data on this comes from June of this year, which is about 30,000 basic science studies on cannabinoids and over 100 published clinical trials. So this is really to speak to those that say there's not enough evidence or there's no science behind this. Really contradicts that in that we have so much preclinical and even human data available for these substances. So with all that research, what did we find out? I think it's really important to appreciate the 2 receptors and the role that they play in everybody's physiology. These receptors are involved in natural homeostasis in our endocannabinoid system to help keep an even keel for our body, so to speak. What's really important to recognize is the difference between these 2. The CB1 receptors is the one that are located primarily in the CNS, and those are responsible for the psychoactive effects. So as research is continuing, we're seeing that some cannabinoids being developed are looking to target just the CB2 receptor to work on inflammation and not cause those psychoactive effects. And so this presents a great therapeutic research opportunity for drug development, as well as the role in pain relief, because the CB2 receptors are expressed in inflammatory states. So having an appreciation for what is happening in your own endogenous system helps one appreciate the therapeutic effects that others are seeking or patients are seeking. This is a great display of where the CB1 receptors are, and this explains why not only does cannabis have these effects, such as appetite stimulation or alterations in movement or coordination, but also the endocannabinoids are involved in these activities as well as regulating your own appetite or dealing with stress or memory. So these things go hand in hand. What's really important to point out is there is no high concentration of CB1 receptors in the base stem or where their cardiorespiratory center is. Hence, there is no documented overdoses or an ability to die from cannabis due to respiratory depression. So this is a really supported by scientific evidence based on where these receptors are located, and hence why you always commonly hear that there have been no deaths reported due to cannabis overdose. And so this kind of is a great visual representation of what's the endocannabinoid system and its primary ligand, anandamide, and this is what your brain makes, and it's made on demand, and it works within your entire body on these CB1 and CB2 receptors to regulate homeostasis. And it was when THC was noted to be similar in its structure, that these THC acts on the same receptors that anandamide does, but just at a much, much stronger agonism effect, and hence there is the psychoactivity produced. But it also speaks to the therapeutic effects of THC acting on these CV receptors to a greater degree than anandamide is able to do. So this is a great slide, a visual representation from a publication looking at cannabinoids as anti-tumor agents, and it's just a nice summary to explain that these are the ones going on in your body, the anandamide and the 2-AG, how they're regulating these physiological processes, and how they work in a different fashion than most drugs do, which I find interesting as a pharmacist, is they are made on demand and they go retrograde back to the presynaptic vesicle to cause alterations in release of neurotransmitters. So they're actually neuromodulators that play an important role in our homeostasis once again, but sometimes there's not enough of those to combat either symptoms of things such as multiple sclerosis or pain, and that's where the phytocannabinoids or plant-based cannabinoids come into play, acting on the same receptor system. So I think, again, the point of these slides was to point out our endogenous system and the physiological basis for those therapeutic effects, and then subsequently the state's use and recognition of their medical benefits. So I just want to make sure we stay on the theme of federalism. So these are the states that have already recognized these therapeutic effects and medical benefits. We are up to 24 now, with Louisiana being the most recent. In addition to the territories, the green states here represent states that have gone ahead with recreational use. And then I've put a few asterisks because, frankly, there are neighbors. So Minnesota has a unique law that doesn't allow for combustible forms, and so it really speaks to the difference and variation in these state laws. No two state laws are the same, and they're dramatically different in terms of the products allowed, the manufacturing or growing of cannabis, or whether it's dictated by dispensaries or compassionate use programs. Very much variation between these state laws. And then the other one I've highlighted is New Mexico here. That was one of the bills that was introduced in the Iowa legislature, was based off of the New Mexico format initially. That bill ultimately failed, but I think it's a good model for most states moving forward, and it's a little bit unique in its coverage of PTSD specifically. Illinois, the comment I wanted to make here is they're just starting their cannabis program, and there's a lot of interesting things about their program that's different than other states. They have over 40 conditions covered by their bill, and from a patient perspective, it's not super patient friendly in that you need about $350 to even apply to be a medical cannabis patient in the state of Illinois, and subsequently on the distribution end, to be a dispensary or a manufacturer, you have to have at least $400,000 in the bank to get enrolled in that process. So there's a lot of critics of the Illinois program looking at it as very much a fundraising opportunity, so to speak. So that was the comment I wanted to make there. And now we have 16 states with CBD oil. I think this is where really a lot of the momentum came from. Everything up until Missouri was all passed in the legislature in 2014. So 10 bills almost monthly were being ratified by the governors and accepted as state laws. And then subsequently, the total is now up to 16. What's kind of interesting is most of these laws define CBD oil as having less than 0.3% THC, but here in Iowa, our bill actually is for less than 3% THC, which allows a little bit more flexibility in the products that are considered legal here in the state of Iowa. So with the 24 from the previous that I have, what I call comprehensive medical programs, combined with the 16 that just have CBD-only programs, that makes a total of 40 of our 50 states that at least recognize the therapeutic value of medical cannabis in some way, shape, or form. So to speak about cannabidiol, because it's kind of what they say, the new kid on the block, or the one that's causing the most stir in terms of activism and addressing this because of its effects in pediatric epilepsy, frankly, is what's really put it on the map. This is nothing new. It's discovered and isolated in 1963. It was isolated even earlier, but defined structurally in 1963. It is non-psychoactive in no way, shape, or form, and in fact, it actually antagonizes the effects of the psychoactivity of THC. So in some therapeutic applications of this, what patients are doing is taking additional CBD to offset those psychoactivity of THC so that they can increase the amount of THC they're putting in their system without having those side effects. So it offers advantages in multiple different ways. What also is very unique of it is it doesn't exactly work on those receptors that we previously talked about, the CB1 and CB2 receptors. However, it indirectly acts on them by inhibiting the breakdown of anandamide, which is your own endogenous cannabinoid. And some would argue that's a better approach overall to keep the anandamide that comes out when it should be expressed and keeping it around in your system longer to have therapeutic effects. Its pain relief is done through this TRP receptor, which is similar to capsaicin. Yeah.
So,
question?
does CBD down-regulate the CB1 receptor?
Not to my knowledge, because its affinity for the CB1 receptor is so low, it's 100-fold less than THC. So I've not seen
there
it.
Is some I believe there's some interaction between the receptor in affecting its ability to bind with THC. I believe the CBD has some interference, and part of my understanding has been that the reason that it may ameliorate the excess psychoactivity is by helping to disengage the THC, because you can get some results pretty quickly if you give CBD to somebody that's having excess psychoactive symptoms.
Yeah.
And I thought it was the relationship with the CB1 receptor, but
they would compete for activity at that receptor and hence antagonizing those effects, but I don't believe it's through downregulation of the receptor.
Well, it just maybe has some antagonistic effects.
Yes, certainly of the THC. And then lastly, all these other effects throughout the body, for example, the serotonin effects is why it's being promising in the treatment of anxiety or potentially PTSD, and the decreased calcium influx into cells is what is currently being looked at as the primary mechanism for its anti-epileptic effects. So as you can see, it's being applied in multiple applications due to its lack of psychoactivity and hence better safety profile, so to speak. And CBD is not the only one out there that is not psychoactive. In fact, the vast majority of the cannabinoids are non-psychoactive, and so what's happened is the demonization of the plant because of its psychoactivity has really led to not learning much, if any, about all these other therapeutic substances in the plant. So the last research I've seen is that there's been about 107 cannabinoids identified, but only 6 of those actually have psychoactivity. So we're really, by not addressing this plant because of the psychoactivity of THC and a few of the other minor cannabinoids, we're missing out on the therapeutic effects, and as you can see, they're very wide-ranging. It's not only CBD, but also CBG, THCA, or some of the other non-psychoactive effects. And this review here, done by researchers in Italy, is probably the gold standard on the upcoming research and therapeutic effects of the non-psychoactive cannabinoids.
Can you find that online?
Absolutely, and I'd be happy to share it with you as well.
Okay, thank you.
When you're talking, your graph shows an anti-ischemic, is that in relation to blood vessels and arteries?
Yes, it is.
So it's got a real cardiac effect, doesn't it?
CBD specifically is being looked at in like post-stroke models specifically, so yes, it does have that anti-ischemic effect.
So what's it doing, or at least what do people think it's doing so far? Is it it's relaxing the blood vessels that constrict and dilate the caliber of these blood vessels?
Exactly, and in a post-infarct or inflammatory state, that's going to be hyper-responsive, and so it's going to quell that, and that's based on what we're seeing some of the endocannabinoids do in those disease states as well. So they become our markers to say what happens when there's an injury in your endogenous system, and can we help that endogenous system out by supplying some of these cannabinoids exogenously.
Sure, because its protection is to clinch these things tight, and as soon as you do that, your blood pressure shoots up, the restricted load on the heart shoots up, and pot relaxes a bunch of the junk. That's great.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the comments. And so this is another myth that I kind of want to dispel as we talk about cannabinoids and the constituents of the plants. I've just used 2 fingerprints here as they're termed from Steep Hill Laboratories, which is one of the leading researchers on the cannabinoids in plants. And so a lot of sort of opponents of medical cannabis say, well, we never know what's in the plant, or these just irrational, crude preparations of the product. And I argue that that's not true at all. These are just 2 examples. Here's one strain that is a high CBD strain. You can see it's about anywhere from 8 to 16% in most samples, and a low THC strain. And what we're finding is really The power is in the synergy between the cannabinoids and the terpenoids, so this can even break down what terpenoids are present in the cannabis strain. So here I've just shown two examples of one being what we might call a high CBD strain, and the other one what we might call a high THC strain. And by having the variety available to patients within your own state specifically, allows you to alter therapeutic effects. They might find more response with one variety versus the other one, and this is really why, because of all the interplay, synergism, or what's termed the entourage effect between the cannabinoids and terpenoids. So I think it's really important to recognize these fingerprints can be done with as little as 100 milligrams of cannabis, so it's tiny amounts, could be sent to laboratories for these analysis, and we can certainly do that here in the state of Iowa with our agricultural expertise. And this is another example of why we miss out on some of the therapeutic effects when we limit our bills to CBD only. This one really speaks to a new strain that's been created that is very high in THCV, actually, and THCV is another non-psychoactive cannabinoid that's also being used for anti-epileptic effects, primarily in Australia. And so, again, the point of this slide is just to point out having a comprehensive program in your state will allow for better patient outcomes, because allowing for the different strains will allow for increased efficacy with some. So many opponents of the CBD oil bills will say, well, it's not a cure-all and it doesn't quell everybody's seizures, and that's absolutely true, because part of the reason for that is there are these other cannabinoid effects that we're kind of missing out on if we're not utilizing them as far as synergy for epilepsy. And so a lot of this has been really well defined and standardized. Dr. Davinsky is the lead researcher for all this, and so as far as terms of summary of does it work and is there medical benefits of CBD or cannabinoids in epilepsy for that matter, we just had a review article published just a month or so ago that looked at this. What's interesting to me is that the very first study on the use for epileptic problem was in the 1980s. And unfortunately, nobody really picked up and started to follow that until 20 years later. So it's unfortunate we don't have much more research. But what we do have as far as the most recent data presented is that at the meeting of the American Academy of Neurologists, they presented preliminary findings for a 14-week study for 100 patients on CBD, and in that, 40% of patients did have at least a 50% reduction or more in their seizures. And again, to kind of go back and review what we just talked about, by being able to alter the amount of CBD or perhaps THCV or these other the other phytocannabinoids, they may have even been able to increase those effects, and why patients really do want to be able to have a variety of strains available to them to see what really works best. This is the most up-to-date graph I could find. It still is missing Louisiana, which is the most recent one to pass a bill. So the ones in the yellow are the ones that have the CBD-only bills. The dark charcoal here is the comprehensive bills, but what kind of sticks out here is the light gray are kind of the ones that are look odd because they have no bills in any way, shape, or form. So as you can see, the United States as a whole has really embraced medical cannabis, and this is why we're here speaking about federalism, as 40 of the states have at least acknowledged this therapeutic benefit. And so something needs to be done at a federal level, as we are in what I'm calling the scheduling dilemma. So that's a good segue into looking at the Controlled Substance Act. This book here, I brought a copy of it, is the official book of the Schaefer Commission, which was set up as part of the Controlled Substance Act to really look at where these substances should be assigned in terms of their abuse potential or medical use. So just to review the Controlled Substance Act, it breaks it down into 5 categories, and today we're going to be evaluating how well have they done in terms of medical cannabis. So the 2 criteria that are the main points in this are whether there's current accepted medical use in the United States and the abuse potential. So we'll look at both those variables. And again, just to highlight that the Controlled Substance Act wasn't the end-all to be-all. It just also incorporated a federal commission to look at this. Unfortunately, that Schaefer report came out and said that Schedule I is probably not the best place for cannabis, but that was completely ignored by the administration at the time, and hence no changes were made. But as early as 1972, when the comprehensive research was done, the government had recognized, or at least a commission of the federal government had recognized its therapeutic potential. So looking at abuse statistics, what I found most interesting in putting this component of the presentation together is we always have these classic hallmark numbers associated with abuse potential here, and these date back to a survey from 1994. And in that research, they found that cannabis use led to about 9% dependence. So if 100 people were to begin using cannabis, about 9 of them would stay using the product. But however, the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic Standardized Criteria for Psychiatric Diseases, was recently updated about 2 years ago, and in there they've redefined this as cannabis use disorder, and they only note that only 1.5 to even 3.5% of users are actually fit the criteria for an abuse disorder. So this traditional 9% is actually hyperinflated to about threefold with current research. There's actually less people that have problems with cannabis use. As you can see, the other addiction statistics are much higher for other substances, but not even tobacco and alcohol are considered in the Controlled Substance Act. And one thing unique to cannabis here is that of all these substances, it doesn't produce any sort of physiological dependence, only what is termed psychological dependence. So for a patient using alcohol heavily who is withdrawing from that, they run the risk of serious repercussions such as seizures, whereas somebody using cannabis who is no longer using it will not suffer any of those consequences, sort of just the psychological effects of wanting to use cannabis, but nothing on a physical level. And just another way to look at this, I found this one interesting as well. So as they were putting these studies together, the National Institutes of Drug Abuse, along with leading researchers at UCSF, ranked these 6 substances that were known to have abilities for abuse potential. And as you can see, cannabis ranks at the lowest ranking, with a 6 there on nearly every category identified. In some cases, it's comparable or less than caffeine for most sakes and purposes. So with all that said, we'll move to the next one. With all that said, let's just for sake of argument say that even though the abuse potential is less than those other substances, let's just say that it's the same. So let's just say we'll leave it in the highest abuse potential. Let's take the 9% and we'll keep that. There's still a major error in the scheduling, because the only real difference between Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 is accepted medical use. And that was what really the whole first half of this spoke to, is that the medical use has already been accepted in 40 of the states. So as you can compare, what are examples of substances considered Schedule 1? Here you see cannabis along with other substances such as heroin and LSD. However, these other highly known substances of abuse with real consequences such as morphine, are opioids, which there's 15,000 overdoses a year, cocaine and methamphetamine. Those are still Schedule 2, simply just because medicine has recognized their therapeutic effect. That is the only difference. I think we all acknowledge that these are much more harmful substances and are associated with a different abuse potential. But even if we call them equal, the crux lies in the accepted medical use.
Yeah, how many states have accepted psilocybin or LSD or heroin? I'm not knocking them, but how many states have accepted them?
I don't believe any states have accepted them.
None.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm not saying they don't have medical use, but they're definitely not accepted.
Right, yeah, if we go there, it's interesting because even psilocybin and LSD these days are being used in therapeutic fashions to treat things
Right.
like
And the
PTSD
restrictions
and
on
such.
research with LSD, psilocybin, and heroin are not as severe as they are with cannabis.
Absolutely. There's very, we'll talk about some of these restrictions and how they've affected a specific study that's been implemented in Arizona. Thanks, Carl. So this is the definition of marijuana or cannabis in the Controlled Substance Act, and so this is what really leads to the restrictions and the barriers set up for research, because they're talking about every compound, the derivative, the preparations, and this has really been the limiting factor and why we don't have the data that everybody seeks so passionately. So just to continue on with the scheduled substances, what's most interesting, I think, of all of these is when THC was evaluated, which is the highly psychoactive substance, on its own as a pharmaceutical product, it did not only meet the criteria for having accepted medical use and was moved into Schedule 2 in 1985, but then later it was shown to not have that greater of abuse potential as those Schedule 2 substances, and so it was later moved into Schedule 3. And what's interesting from my background as a pharmacist is this is the only substance that's ever moved schedules to a less restricted schedule in the history of since the Controlled Substance Act. So of all of the substances out there, this is the only one that's made a step backwards. Yes?
Okay. I'm not familiar entirely. I Schedule 1 and Schedule 2,
Mhm.
but I hadn't heard about Schedule 3, 4, 5.
Yeah, 3, 4, and 5, they're sort of less important in the debate because they're just a lot of the other meds like Xanax or Valium, a lot of other meds that are accepted as they do have abuse potential, but not to the same degree as something like cocaine or methamphetamine. So it's just a lower ranking in terms of their abuse potential, and they all have considered therapeutic values. And so what's interesting about this is they even said when it's just the pure product, which causes highly psychoactive effects, it's less abuse than the plant itself, which is a very contradictory.
So it wouldn't be contraindicated to move marijuana to one of these lower ones?
Yeah, it could even go to the lower ones, exactly. And that's what's interesting about this is when THC's been evaluated, they thought it didn't even fit Schedule 2 criteria and thought it even should have less restrictions. And so that's what's really the sort of oxymoronic point here.
So try to get it down to Schedule 4, 5.
Or perhaps not even scheduled.
Or not even scheduled.
That's just a thought. Yes.
I'd be very interested in what we've got for precedent, both the scheduling law and history in this nation of substances, a real list of these, and you just made it clear that there's not very many, that have actually been rescheduled, either up or down. Do we have some way that we can get a list of things like that?
Yeah, I can see if I can put something together, but this is the only one that's moved in the
Yeah,
down
the
fashion.
DEA has a list like that. I've
That's
seen
what
it
it takes.
recently. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to see that list.
Thank you.
That's precedent law.
The other point to make on this is that the physician must have a DEA number in order to prescribe Schedule 2 through Schedule 5. There are, so that's another outcome of having it scheduled at all.
Yeah.
So that, you know, a lot of the current thinking is that it shouldn't even have a schedule number. It's a plant.
Right, absolutely. I think these are all great points and really speak to the scheduling dilemma. Exactly.
Ready?
And so a lot of people have recognized this sort of need to change things. And so these are just some of the major organizations. There's several more. There's a list at least a page long of different organizations that support this, but some of the big ones are the Academy of Pediatrics, Academy of Neurology, College of Physicians, and the most recent one from just this past month was voted on by the American Academy of Family Physicians. And so all of these organizations have recognized the need for reform and scheduling. And part of the reason for that reform is the need to know more research, but one of the unlikely supporters of reform actually comes from the National Institutes of Drug Abuse. And so what's important to remind you guys here is that the National Institutes of Drug Abuse have traditionally funded most research that looks at the harmful effects of cannabis. And now we have the director testifying on behalf of CBD in terms of beneficial effects. So this is really important to know. Her full testimony is available online, and what she kind of pointed out is the highlights, is we know that there's a therapeutic potential. Yep, thank you, Carl. That there's a known therapeutic potential. We know that there's no intoxication or euphoria. We know from preclinical research that there's applications in multiple different disease states, and again, some of these disease states, what people don't appreciate, we don't really have good drugs for them. You know, I think that's one of the biggest points about all this is these are the patients that are suffering the most. And the National Institutes of Drug Abuse has already begun work to study this in terms of epilepsy. So our own government is working on this at this point in time.
Can I please add one item to item 3 there, another element?
Sure.
Anti-nausea.
Absolutely. And then safety profile, as we talked about, because there's a different pharmacology between THC and CBD, there's a different safety profile. So with it not activating those CB1 receptors that we talked about earlier, there is no psychoactivity. So these alterations, these are her terms here, alterations in thinking and perception by THC are not observed with CBD. She also noted that over 25 studies did not observe significant side effects, and that because CBD is readily used in multiple countries in Europe, that we have all kinds of information about the metabolism, toxicology, or safety. So it's not a question about what we know from a safety side, it's what do we not know from a therapeutic side. And so, of course, she acknowledges all these research opportunities, and these are some of the barriers of why people say, I want to see the data, I want to see the research. She's acknowledging it's not so easy. There are these things here that are important. There's all the regulatory requirements, such as the extra additional red tape, and we'll discuss an example of that. There's the lack of finding good CBD that's produced under the good manufacturing processes, and then the lack of data because CBD is coming from different places and different dispensaries all around the country. There's not really a standardization quite yet. And so it's not so simple as just saying, well, if there was data, we would have it. There's a lot of barriers in place currently. Because NIH is looking at the treatment of substance abuse orders and THC effects are offset by CBD, they're actually looking at it for therapeutic effects, as mentioned earlier, for THC-induced psychosis. So that takes us to the Iowa law, where, of course, we'll have Carl speaking later, and he's the expert on this, but what I just want to note here is that when the Board of Pharmacy made their ruling to acknowledge the medical benefit, that in my world, the National Board of Pharmacy actually awarded them an award partly for its efforts to combat illegal distribution of drugs on the internet, but also for its efforts to reclassify marijuana as a Schedule II controlled substance. So they were actually given an award for being open-minded and diligent in looking at the research there. However, it wasn't until about 2014 that there was ever a bill really introduced that got any sort of momentum there. This bill failed, but what was important about it was kind of the starting point for all of the changes here in Iowa. So what bill did pass in 2014, we did have the Cannabidiol Act passed. And what it does is it protects families from prosecution for possessing cannabidiol oil only in the treatment of irretractable epilepsy when certified by a state neurologist. It allows for a certain month supply, 6 month supply approximately, but why it's faced a lot of criticism is what it doesn't do. It doesn't provide any access within the state at all, and it doesn't comply with Colorado or Nebraska laws, and why I picked them out specifically is at the time it was just thought that patients would easily drive through Nebraska into Colorado to purchase this, which is certainly not an option from a legal standpoint from either of those state laws. And then it doesn't allow for any products with greater than 3% THC, which allows for more variety or different components of cannabis to be isolated. So the last part is that there's a lot of other patients suffering that aren't getting any of the benefits from this because it only covered irretractable epilepsy. So patients who might be wanting to use the product for treatment of cancer, PTSD, pain, or any other syndromes were completely excluded by this bill. So it was a step in the right direction, but fell significantly short. This is a nice article from the Associated Press over the summer, and it really speaks to how this has come under a lot of criticism lately, or since its inception, really. And at this point in time, the most recent data I saw was about 70 cards had been issued. At the point where 50 were issued, it cost our state $115,000 in taxpayer dollars to produce those 50 cards. So we are spending a lot of money to produce these and get these patients certified, but yet there's no avenue for them to get the product. So just some commentary, sort of comprehensive. We touched on some of the state laws, so I'll kind of pass on that, but the federal laws still stands at its Schedule I. There's no medical use, which leads to more restrictions and red tape, and there must be different applications filed with the DEA, and we'll talk about how that affected a major trial in Arizona. We're up to 40 states, and it's nothing new. The first one was in 1996, so we're nearly 20 years into this, and so a lot of opponents say, well, we don't know what's going to happen, or I'm unsure of the repercussions, and we have a lot of different states that we can look for a long period of time. Many people don't know about how the federal government actually had a compassionate use program where they actually supplied cannabis cigarettes to patients from 1978 to 1991, so they've at least acknowledged the therapeutic benefit in that fashion. And then lastly, what's interesting is the United States actually holds a patent for the use of cannabinoids as antioxidants and neuroprotectants. So they're very contradictory in their own practice to what their own laws say, as they've at least supplied cannabis and at least tried to patent the cannabinoids. So I think the next slide is just a helpful way to, oh, and then on the state law side, I just wanted to point out, in New Mexico is the highest prevalence of PTSD patients. Not every state covers PTSD. I believe the total is 7 to 9, depending on how you shake it out. But in the New Mexico program, over half of their patients qualify under the auspices of PTSD. So that's very unique to New Mexico.
Anything else?
Nope, thank you. So here's the patent. I just think it's worth seeing with your own two eyes. So it's cannabinoids as antioxidants and neuroprotectants, assigned to the Health and Human Services Department. And so it really speaks about why we are in the crux that we are in. We have the government acknowledging the therapeutic effects, yet not acknowledging the therapeutic effects at the same time. So this is one I'm going to walk through really quickly. There's a lot of dates and details here, but the big point is that there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that patients and veterans suffering from PTSD are benefiting from using medical cannabis. And so because there's such a interest in this, and we have so many veterans coming back with PTSD, and the suicide rates are through the roof for veterans, one of the researchers at the University of Arizona had partnered with a major organization looking to fund this research or support this research to address this health concern. And so the next few slides I'll walk through relatively fast, but I just want to point out the barriers that are in place currently for research. So the initial point of this starts around this time in 2010. The initial investigational new drug application was received by the FDA, and they put the study immediately on hold. A few months go by until they start to find issues with the protocol. Later the protocol is revised and sent in, so you can see how much time has lapsed here. Go ahead with the next one. Then finally they accept it by the FDA, but then they have to submit it onto other federal organizations. So the Health and Human Services, NIDA, and then the Health and Human Services says we'll have it available soon. As you can see, several amount of time goes through, and ultimately the protocol is rejected. Then the University of Arizona at the same time has approved the protocol, so they have to resubmit it. And then finally the Health and Human Services. So just note that 4 years has already passed in this time where patients could be enrolled or actually receiving beneficial therapeutic effects from the products. And then in April of 2014, NIDA says that it doesn't have the cannabis available. Once the protocol is approved, then it says, sorry, we don't actually have the product there for you. And in the meantime of trying to acquire the product to do the research, the primary investigator finds out that she actually, this is a nice way of saying she got fired by the University of Arizona for being involved primarily in this research. However, the state of Colorado really stepped up to the plate and said, we're having all this increased economic gain from therapeutic cannabis, and they have given $2 million to fund this study. So where it stands at this point in time is that the IRB has been approved at Johns Hopkins, and it's pending DEA approval still. So this is just an example of showing you why Schedule I really affects research and research opportunities. Here's one researcher's attempt to help patients with PTSD in 5 years of red tape and bureaucracy. So the last part of this is closing up is what is out there already and what's right around the corner for us and how are those going to affect scheduling. So what do we currently have? Most people are familiar with Marinol, which is the synthetic THC that we discussed earlier. Again, this is Schedule 3. Originally it was in Schedule 2 but moved. We've been using cannabis-based products since 1985. So THC has been recognized for its therapeutic effects by the FDA, at least that long, or at least THC in this synthetic form has. We also had a second brother or analog of THC come along, Nabilone. This one's far more potent than Marinol, and hence it's only available in 1 milligram capsules, but this one has remained in Schedule 2 for that reason. The ones right around the corner, one of them is Nabiximols or Sativex. This is produced by a company out of England, GW Pharmaceuticals. What's unique about this product is it's the first time where it's been available to have both THC and CBD in a comparable ratio here, so it can attenuate the effects of THC as well as get the therapeutic effects of CBD. What's interesting to me about this product is it's a complete natural product extract, so nobody's synthesizing these chemicals and putting them together in the spray bottle. They are the actual plants being condensed down to an extract of that.
Are they still isolating each one though? So they're not getting the terpene profile or anything like that, correct?
My understanding is that they're the same strains that are genetically the same, and then they are using that whole plant extract. So I believe there are the terpenoids in them. They're just not accounted for, labeled, or documented as in how much are in there, but I can double check.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty sure that was my understanding is the whole plant extract. Yes.
In order to produce a product like that, do they use organic solvents to extract from the whole plant? In other words, it's a form of modified hash oil is what it is.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a good way to say it. I think they use CO2 extraction process for
The
theirs.
supercritical stuff. And that would allow them to pull out very exact molecules. Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
And to speak to the other question here is, if it is just the CBD that's in THC, that would be a negative effect because we're missing out on those terpenoids.
Well, that's the reason I'm asking.
Yeah.
The reason I think a week or two ago they released preliminary problems with the MS study they're doing with Sativex right now in the U.S. and the fact that a lot of patients are not reacting as well to it as they've reported reacting to
I would say from a pharmacological standpoint, whole plant cannabis would be the preferred, just to be clear. And so this product's been approved already in 25 countries. Our neighbors to the north have had it for over a decade. And as Boris has mentioned, phase 3 trials are currently underway for multiple conditions here in the United States: multiple sclerosis, cancer-related pain. There's even a trial looking at it for its safety profile in glioma. And so what this poses is what is going to happen as far as scheduling goes when this is FDA approved, which is expected in next year at some point that this will be approved, because it's already in 25 countries, mostly in Europe. So the scheduling dilemma is here on the right side of the slide. Currently, it's Schedule 1 at this point in time. The DA must therefore approve these study protocols that are underway. It has to be imported as well, and this product's produced in England. As mentioned, after approval, what should we expect? I think it's safe to say maybe expect Schedule 2 or a Schedule 3 substance, as THC is. What's interesting is in the United Kingdom, before their Schedule 1 was similar to our Schedule 1, and now it's moved to Schedule 4, which is the least restricted in the United Kingdom. So that would be about equivalent to where the benzodiazepines or a drug like Valium lies. So it'll be interesting to see what is done with this and how that'll subsequently affect other products similar to this. And then the other new product around the corner is cannabidiol. This one is just pure CBD here. Right now there's the phase 3 trials underway. The University of Iowa is one of the study sites for that. They have about 15 or 20 of the patients in the major study enrolled there. We expect the results, but I've also reported some of the preliminary findings. This one also poses the scheduling dilemma here, because after this drug is approved, where will it fall within our five schedules, or will it even be scheduled at all if there is no abuse potential? So these are going to be really big decisions that are going to have to come out here in 2016.
So I'm really curious because I haven't seen anything. Is this a natural plant extract or is this synthesized CBD?
This is a natural plant extract as well. Thank you. Yeah. And so, kind of to summarize some of these things, what's interesting is that at a federal level, again, these cannabinoids are considered Schedule 1, but yet pure THC is FDA approved and is in Schedule 3, and that was actually a lessening from its original Schedule 2. We still have 24 plus 16, making a total of 40 states covering this. As we discussed, we have the federal program for compassionate use as well as the patent. So all of these things are very contradictory to the Schedule 1. And then when we get to cannabidiol specifically, this really poses a problem because there is no psychoactivity and hence no abuse potential noted. So what will happen for that as we move forward? Yes?
Did Marinol get moved twice? Did he move out of 1 to 2 and then from 2 to 3? Oh, we
Correct.
like that. We
Yeah.
really like that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, Marinol was considered a molecule, and it was in Schedule 1 because it was in marijuana. So the first thing that happened was it was placed in Schedule 2. That was the first action.
Yeah, so you could say inherently it was Schedule 1.
I want that precedent, guys. I want that precedent.
And then some more summary as we move forward. So here are my recommendations as a healthcare provider, and what I think we should do is, one is we should just remove them completely for Schedule 1 because they're recognized medical use in 40 states around the country. And again, that's the discussion here about federalism. If you leave them in the scheduling, that recognizes abuse potential. So for opponents of taking them completely out or taking THC completely out, we can account for that. And I think research should be undertaken just as it was in the 70s by the Schaefer Commission and determine what is the appropriate scheduling. I don't think I have the answer. I don't think any of us have the answer of where it actually belongs, but I think it's safe to say it's not in Schedule 1 because it does have accepted medical use. And then, of course, by moving it out of Schedule 1, this will lead to the increased research that everybody wants to know. What will be the therapeutic effects? What will be that safety profile? And this will help things such as the PTSD study that we discussed and the bureaucracy that led to the delay in that. And for me, I call this seeing the big picture. I think a lot of opponents of medical cannabis say, well, we don't know what the effects are. And I think I would argue that we definitely know what the negative effects are of cannabis. It's been funded by the National Institute of Drug Abuse for the last 40 years. We know pretty much everything we can know about the harm of cannabis. I don't think we need to review those. We all know that developing minds should probably not use any psychoactive substances, including THC. We know that there may be some effects in terms of the smoking and bronchitis, but that's what we know. So we already know everything we can about this safety side. It's time to learn about the efficacy side. And what people that are not necessarily involved in medicine may not appreciate is where are we with current therapeutic options for these patients. So what do we actually have for cancer right now? What do we have for multiple sclerosis or PTSD? or refractory epilepsy. How well are those meds working? And I'll tell you firsthand, they're not working that well at all, and that's why people are seeking this out. I'm not up here, nor is anybody else saying, if you have high blood pressure, you should smoke cannabis for that, because the research doesn't lead to that, and we have actually great drugs to treat your hypertension or your heart attack. But for these conditions, these are patients suffering, and we don't have great options for them. In some cases, the best option is opioids, which again leads to overdoses, both intentional and unintentional. So we should weigh the risks and benefits for this for each patient individually, and the JAMA article, the Journal of American Association, recently put out some criteria that should be considered. So if we have debilitating conditions, they've failed first and second line pharmacological options, they've tried one of the FDA-approved cannabinoids, they don't have any substance abuse disorder or psychiatric disorder that might be exacerbated by cannabis, and there's a state law for them, then why not consider this for them? So again, looking at the big picture of patients in the context is what is currently available for them and how well are those options working for them is, I think, an important component of this. So ending on the same page, I think Dr. Vicaria, which is one of the leading founders of the medical cannabis program in California, during sort of the AIDS epidemic and patients finding relief with the use of medical cannabis, put it pretty well when he said, we should be thinking cannabis as a medicine first that happens to have some psychoactive properties, as many medicines do, rather than an intoxicant that happens to have a few therapeutic properties on the side. So again, understanding that physiological basis, understanding the amount of research that's truly out there will help you appreciate that this is a medicine first, should be recognized as such and removed from Schedule 1, and the psychoactive effects are a small side effect of that entire thing. So we'll see how well we did. So the goal here was to review and compare Schedule 1 and Schedule 2. I think we did that. Really the main criteria has to do with accepted medical use. So we'll assess if cannabis met that criteria based on the fact that 40 states acknowledged its medical use, as well as having a robust amount of research and physiological basis for its therapeutic effects. I would say that it does not meet the criteria of Schedule 1. We talked about the benefits for moving Schedule 1 in terms of clinical research. The example presented was a 5-year lag in just doing a single study on PTSD patients, which is a very major area of need. We're going to assess whether non-psychoactive cannabinoids meet the criteria for Schedule 1. Looking at the abuse potential for cannabis as a whole, with the THC component being really around only 3% now, it's really hard to think that any of the non-psychoactive cannabinoids that don't produce euphoria will have any reason to be scheduled at all. We wanted to appreciate what NIDA is saying about cannabidiol, and they've actually testified in behalf of cannabidiol to increase research application of that. And then lastly, we wanted to look at what cannabis-based medicines are either currently approved, so just keep in mind we've had 2 cannabis-based medicines since 1980s, and that there's 2 more in phase 3 trials right around the corner. So this is something that, as a health professional, we have to be up to speed upon, because our patients will either be asking about both medical cannabis in its crude form or plant form, as well as the FDA products available. So I think that summarizes what we just covered here, and this is a picture of the only currently licensed farm to produce cannabis, which again is a barrier to research, because there's only one place that's licensed to do this, and they don't necessarily have the variety of strains necessarily wanted, or the quality available for most researchers, and this is located here at the University of Mississippi. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Did the feds, there were hothouses in Colorado growing these different strains. I thought some of them had been under investigation or arrest by the federal government.
Yes, so recently the federal government has said that they're not going to use taxpayer dollars to come into states and disrupt, as long as they're okay under the state laws. So yes, for a while there was a lot of concern with taxpayer dollars going in to raid dispensaries or raid these type of places. But in the last, I think, about year and a half or so, they've moved to pass a law to prevent that from happening. So it may happen on occasions, but it's less of an issue currently, because the state's rights have really kind of stepped up there. Yes?
Are you not appraised of the marijuana farm just north of Ames?
No, I'm not aware of that.
Well, let me fill you in a little bit. First off, it's got 3 layers of chain link fences around it, dogs, guards, and when they run the big stuff up there by the Ames Bio facility, they will shoot you. And it is, I don't know, several acres in size, and I've never seen anybody like you talk about it, and it exists.
Okay, that's interesting. This is, yeah, the one I showed.
I've seen it with my own eyes.
Was the ones that were just basically the only one licensed by the federal government.
Well, these are very licensed by the federal government.
Are they?
Mhm.
Okay, interesting.
It's related to the bio facility, and they don't want you to know about it, apparently. Yeah, I've seen it with my own eyes, and it is a big fat pot farm, folks.
Interesting.
And they grow the high-grade stuff, they have dogs, guns, you name it, they go bananas. When they make a run, you know, because they're all around it.
And it looks like, Carl, you found my last slide here, but a couple things here.
You have a bunch more.
Well, they were just in case questions came up, but these are things I usually hear from opposition statements, and I just thought maybe I'll just take 1 second to address them real quickly. So unintended consequences is a key phrase that you often hear from legislators say, well, we're not sure the unintended consequences. Again, we have 40 states and 24 comprehensive medical programs we can look at. There's been research done extensively on the effects of the adolescent use. There's at least been 5 papers, the most recent one in Lancet just earlier this year, that show that the implementation of medical cannabis laws do not increase adolescent use in the state. There's no correlation with that. Its consequences on the general public are actually beneficial because what research is showing is that once a state passes a medical cannabis program, there's actually less mortality due to opioid overdoses, and there's a big correlation between the amount of opioids needed when a patient's using cannabinoids. So there's actually the effects or the consequences on the public are probably going to be beneficial. I often hear, well, we don't know if you're giving a child with epilepsy CBD, what that's going to do to brain development. I think we do know what 300 seizures a day does to brain development, and so I don't know that we have much to lose here. And again, CBD is really an antioxidant. I think for most people that don't have appreciation for it, it's sort of like, as benign as omega-3s from olive oil for that matter. I think that's an easy analogy. There's the catch-22 that's out there that you have people say, well, I don't have the research, show me the data. Most of those people haven't looked for the research or the data to start, but it's kind of a catch-22 because if it's scheduled as Schedule 1, how am I going to produce that research for you to make a strong argument? And so it's kind of obviously no man's land. And lastly, it's not a panacea, and I would agree with that in all sakes and purposes. With the examples we described, patient with hypertension, it's not going to be an option for them, or areas where we have good therapeutic options, it's not going to be considered as a medication for them. But in the setting of a patient with epilepsy, I'd really challenge anybody to take Topamax for a month and see how they feel or such, and compare that to what are the current available treatment options, or patients with multiple sclerosis for that matter. Why should we withhold anything that may improve their activities of daily living or quality of life? So that's kind of my take on what those people that may not agree or are familiar with the science